The morning sun barely broke through the thick gray clouds hanging over the aircraft carrier USS Roosevelt as Sarah Martinez made her way down to the ammunition deck. Her boots echoed against the metal floors, a sound she had grown accustomed to over the past 18 months. The carrier was massive, a floating city with over 5,000 personnel, and Sarah was just one small part of the operation. She preferred it that way. Being invisible meant fewer questions, and fewer questions meant she could focus on her work without anyone digging into her past. Sarah was an aviation ordnanceman second class, responsible for handling, storing, and loading ammunition and weapons onto the fighter jets that launched from the carrier's deck. It was demanding work that required precision, strength, and an unwavering attention to safety protocols. One mistake with live ammunition could cost lives, and Sarah took that responsibility seriously. She had always been meticulous, even back in her childhood, in a small town in Texas where she learned to fix things alongside her father in his auto repair shop. The ammunition storage area was located deep within the ship's belly, a series of reinforced compartments designed to withstand almost anything. Sarah entered her workstation and began her morning routine, checking inventory logs and inspecting the storage conditions. The temperature and humidity had to remain within specific parameters to prevent degradation of the ordnance. She moved methodically through her checklist, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. Her coworkers filtered in gradually. There was Jenkins, a loud guy from Philadelphia who never stopped talking about cheesesteaks. Miller, quiet and studious, always had his nose in a technical manual. And Rodriguez, who had become something of a friend to Sarah, though she kept even that relationship at arm's length. They worked well together as a team, loading bomb carts, moving missiles, and preparing weapons for the next flight operations. What none of them knew was that Sarah carried a weight far heavier than any of the ordnance they handled. Beneath her uniform, hidden against her skin, hung a medal she had been awarded 3 years ago. It was a silver star, one of the highest decorations for valor in combat. The ribbon was faded now, the metal slightly tarnished from being concealed for so long. Sarah kept it tucked inside her undershirt, close to her heart, where no one could see it. The medal represented a moment in Sarah's life that she desperately wanted to forget. She had been deployed in a different capacity then, serving with a Special Operations Support Unit in a hostile territory that the public knew little about. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong. Her team had been ambushed while transporting critical intelligence, and in the chaos that followed, Sarah had made split-second decisions that saved the lives of 7 people but cost the lives of 2 others. The official report called her actions heroic. They said she had shown extraordinary courage under fire, maintaining her composure while coordinating a defense and evacuation under impossible circumstances. The Silver Star ceremony had been formal and prestigious, with officers praising her bravery. But Sarah remembered the screams, the blood, the faces of the 2 soldiers who didn't make it home. She remembered Corporal Davis, only 22 years old, who had joked about his wedding plans just hours before. She remembered Sergeant Thompson, a father of 3, who had covered her position until he couldn't anymore. After receiving the medal, Sarah had requested a transfer and a change in her military occupation. She wanted to move away from direct combat roles, away from situations where her decisions might cost lives. The Navy had accommodated her request, and she retrained as an aviation ordnanceman. The work was still dangerous and still vital to the mission, but it felt different. She was supporting the fight from behind the scenes now, not leading people into harm's way. Sarah never wore the Silver Star publicly. She never mentioned it to her new unit. When she transferred to the Roosevelt, she made sure her service record was scrubbed of the specific details that would draw attention. The medal itself, she should have left in storage or sent home to her mother, but she couldn't bring herself to do either. Keeping it close felt like a penance, a reminder of what she had lost, and what she had learned about herself in those terrible moments. The morning shift progressed normally. Sarah and her team moved through their assignments with practiced efficiency. They loaded AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles onto transport carts, secured them with proper restraints, and moved them to the elevator that would take them topside. The carrier was preparing for flight operations, and everything had to be ready before the first FA-18 Super Hornet launched from the catapult. During a brief break, Rodriguez sat down next to Sarah in the small break area adjacent to the workspace. He offered her a protein bar, which she accepted with a nod of thanks. Rodriguez was easy to be around because he respected boundaries. He talked about his family in California, his plans after the Navy, and his obsession with learning to surf. But he never pried into Sarah's personal life beyond casual questions. "You ever think about what you'll do after?" Rodriguez asked, unwrapping his own protein bar. "When your contract is up?" Sarah chewed slowly, considering the question. "Maybe go back to school. Learn something completely different. Work with my hands, but without all this." She gestured vaguely at the ammunition around them. "You'd be good at that," Rodriguez said. "You've got steady hands. Patient. I've seen you work. You don't rush." Sarah appreciated the observation. Patience was something she had learned the hard way. In combat, rushing got people killed. In her current role, rushing could trigger an explosion. She had built her entire approach to life around careful, measured actions. The break ended, and they returned to work. The day's major task involved restocking ammunition that had been depleted during the previous week's training exercises. Pallets of ordnance had been brought aboard during a recent resupply operation, and now they needed to be properly sorted, inspected, and stored. It was physical work that left everyone sweating despite the air conditioning. Sarah was directing a forklift operator when she felt something shift beneath her uniform. Her hand instinctively went to her chest, and she realized, with a spike of panic, that the chain holding her silver star had broken. The metal was sliding down inside her shirt. She stepped away from the work area, trying to appear casual as she moved toward a less crowded corner. She reached inside her uniform and caught the metal before it could fall completely. The chain had snapped at the clasp, probably weakened from years of constant wear. Sarah's heart pounded as she looked down at the metal in her palm. The 5-pointed star gleamed dully in the fluorescent light, the ribbon bunched around it. She quickly shoved it into her cargo pocket, her mind racing. She needed to find a new chain or a way to secure it before someone saw it. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Sarah was distracted, constantly aware of the weight in her pocket. Every time someone walked past, she tensed, worried that somehow they would know, that they would ask questions she didn't want to answer. When the shift finally ended, she headed straight to her berthing area, a small compartment she shared with 3 other women. Fortunately, the space was empty. Sarah pulled out the metal and examined the broken chain. The clasp had completely separated from the links. She would need to replace it, but finding jewelry supplies on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean was not exactly easy. She considered her options. The Navy Exchange store might have something, though it would be a long shot. She could also ask one of the supply specialists if they had any wire or cord that could serve as a temporary solution. For now, she wrapped the metal carefully in a clean handkerchief and tucked it into the bottom of her locker, beneath her spare uniforms. It felt wrong to leave it there, exposed, even in that small way. But she couldn't carry it loose in her pocket. Too many risks. Too many chances for it to fall out. That evening, Sarah made her way to the ship's library, a quiet space that few people used. She liked to spend her free time there, reading or just sitting in the relative peace. The carrier was never truly quiet, the constant hum of machinery and ventilation systems, a permanent backdrop, but the library offered a respite from the crowded and noisy living quarters. She found a worn copy of a mystery novel and settled into one of the chairs, but she couldn't concentrate on the words. Her mind kept drifting back to the metal, to the memories it represented. She thought about Corporal Davis and his fiancée, who Sarah had met at the funeral. The young woman had hugged Sarah and thanked her for trying to save him, but Sarah had seen the emptiness in her eyes. She thought about Sergeant Thompson's children, who had been so small at the memorial service, too young to fully understand that their father was never coming home. Sarah had attended both funerals, had stood in her dress uniform and saluted as the flag-draped coffins were lowered into the ground. She had spoken briefly with the families, offering condolences that felt inadequate and hollow. And then she had requested her transfer, determined to rebuild herself into someone who would never have to make those kinds of decisions again. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her workstation early. She wanted to get ahead on the day's tasks and then slip away to the Navy Exchange during a break to look for a replacement chain. But as she entered the ammunition storage area, she found that the day's assignment list had changed. There was a note indicating that Admiral Richardson would be conducting a routine inspection of the ordnance handling procedures that afternoon. Sarah's stomach tightened. Admiral Richardson was the Carrier Strike Group commander, a 3-star admiral with decades of experience and a reputation for being both brilliant and intimidating. He rarely came down to the lower decks, and when he did, it was usually for important operational reasons or formal inspections. The crew would be expected to demonstrate perfect procedures and answer any questions the admiral might have. The morning became a flurry of preparation. The entire work area was cleaned and organized beyond its already strict standards. Every piece of equipment was inspected and positioned precisely. The team rehearsed their procedures, making sure every movement was textbook perfect. Sarah threw herself into the preparation, grateful for the distraction from her own concerns. By early afternoon, word came down that the Admiral was on his way. The team assembled in formation, and Sarah took her position among them. She had pulled her uniform into perfect alignment, her boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything was regulation perfect, except for the absence of the medal hidden in her locker several decks above. Admiral Richardson arrived with his aide and the carrier's commanding officer. He was a tall man with iron gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The team snapped to attention as he entered, and he returned the salute before asking them to carry on with their work so he could observe their procedures in action. Sarah and her team demonstrated the proper handling of a Sidewinder missile, from retrieving it from storage through the safety checks and loading procedures. They moved with practiced precision, each person executing their role exactly as trained. The Admiral watched intently, occasionally asking questions about weight limits, safety protocols, or emergency procedures. Sarah was in the middle of explaining the environmental monitoring system when Rodriguez, who was helping demonstrate the loading procedures, stumbled slightly while maneuvering a cart. It was barely noticeable, just a brief loss of balance that he immediately corrected, but in that split second, Sarah instinctively reached out to steady both him and the cart. Her reaction was fast, her movements sure, and the moment passed without incident. But Admiral Richardson had been watching. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed not on Rodriguez but on Sarah. "Good reflexes, petty officer," he said. "Quick thinking prevents accidents." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, standing at attention. The Admiral continued his inspection, and Sarah began to relax. The demonstration concluded successfully, and Admiral Richardson spent a few more minutes asking questions about inventory management and ammunition tracking systems. Then he began to make his way toward the exit, and Sarah allowed herself to believe that the inspection had passed without any complications. She was wrong. As the Admiral walked past her position, he paused and turned back. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he studied her face with an intensity that made Sarah's pulse quicken. She kept her expression neutral, her posture perfect, but inside she felt a growing sense of unease. "Petty Officer Martinez," the Admiral said slowly, reading her name tape. "Have we met before?" Sarah's mind raced as she stood before Admiral Richardson. She had been careful, so careful, to avoid situations exactly like this. Her transfer paperwork had been processed through standard channels, and she had specifically requested that her commendation records remain separate from her daily personnel file. But standing here now, under the Admiral's scrutinizing gaze, she wondered if her past had finally caught up with her. "No, sir, I don't believe so," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. It wasn't technically a lie. She had never personally met the Admiral, though she knew it was possible he had been present at the Silver Star ceremony 3 years ago. There had been so many officers that day, so many faces blurred together by her overwhelming desire to be anywhere else. The Admiral continued to study her for a long moment. Sarah could feel the attention of everyone in the room shifting toward them. Rodriguez looked confused. Miller appeared nervous, and Jenkins had frozen mid-step with a clipboard in his hands. The commanding officer who accompanied the Admiral had also turned to observe the exchange, his expression curious. "You look familiar," Admiral Richardson said finally. "What was your previous duty station?" Sarah's throat felt tight. "I transferred from shore duty, sir. Naval support activity in Norfolk. Before that, various assignments." It was vague enough to be unhelpful, but specific enough to be truthful. The Admiral nodded slowly but didn't seem entirely satisfied with the answer. For a terrible moment, Sarah thought he might press further, might ask for details that would unravel the careful anonymity she had built. But then his aide stepped forward and murmured something about the next scheduled inspection, and the moment passed. "Carry on, petty officer," the Admiral said, and then he was moving toward the exit with his entourage following behind. Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Rodriguez caught her eye and raised his eyebrows in a silent question, but Sarah just shook her head slightly. The inspection was over, and they could return to normal operations. The team dispersed, the tension easing as people returned to their regular duties. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The Admiral's interest in her had been more than casual, and the way he had studied her face suggested recognition, even if he couldn't quite place where he had seen her before. She needed to be more careful, needed to ensure that nothing else drew attention to her. During her lunch break, Sarah finally made it to the Navy Exchange. The small store carried basic necessities and a limited selection of other items for the crew. She searched through the jewelry section, which consisted mostly of watches and a few pieces of costume jewelry meant as gifts. Eventually, she found a simple silver chain that would work. It wasn't as sturdy as the one that had broken, but it would have to do. She purchased the chain and returned to her berthing area. Her roommates were at lunch, giving her a few minutes of privacy. Sarah retrieved the metal from her locker and carefully threaded the new chain through the suspension ring. She held it up, watching it turn slowly in the light. The five-pointed star, the small figure of Minerva in the center, the ribbon with its red, white, and blue stripes. It was beautiful in its own way, but to Sarah, it represented only pain. She fastened the chain around her neck and tucked the metal beneath her undershirt, feeling its familiar weight settle against her skin. It was like putting on armor, except this armor didn't protect her from anything. It only reminded her of what she wanted to forget. The afternoon shift was routine. Sarah and her team conducted inventory checks and prepared ammunition loads for the next day's flight operations. The work was methodical and consuming, which suited Sarah perfectly. When her hands were busy and her mind was focused on technical details, there was no room for memories or regrets. That evening, Sarah decided to work out in the ship's gym. Physical exercise was another way she kept her demons at bay. The gym was crowded during peak hours, filled with sailors trying to maintain their fitness in the limited space available on the carrier. Sarah preferred to go late, after most people had finished, when she could run on the treadmill or lift weights without the noise and energy of a crowd around her. She was 40 minutes into a run when Rodriguez appeared on the treadmill next to hers. He didn't say anything at first, just started his own workout, but Sarah knew he had something on his mind. Rodriguez wasn't the type to corner someone for a conversation, but he also wasn't the type to let something go if he thought a friend might need to talk. After a few minutes, he glanced over. That was weird today. With the Admiral. Sarah kept her eyes forward, her pace steady. He thought I looked familiar. Happens sometimes. You sure that's all it was? Because for a second there, it seemed like he really recognized you. Sarah considered how to respond. Rodriguez was perceptive, and brushing him off completely might make him more curious. She decided on a version of the truth that wouldn't reveal too much. I might have crossed paths with him at some official function. You know how it is. Big ceremonies, lots of people. He probably saw me at one of those. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Makes sense, I guess. Still, it looked like it made you uncomfortable. I don't like being the center of attention, Sarah said, which was absolutely true, especially not from a 3-star admiral during an inspection. That seemed to satisfy him. Rodriguez smiled and turned his attention back to his own workout. They ran in companionable silence for another 20 minutes before Sarah called it a night. She headed to the showers, then back to her berthing area, where she finally crawled into her rack and pulled the curtain for privacy. In the darkness of her small sleeping space, Sarah allowed herself to think about the day. The Admiral's attention had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. She had worked so hard to become just another sailor, just another member of the crew doing her job without distinction or notice. The idea that her past might be catching up with her filled her with a dread she couldn't quite name. She thought about the men and women she had served with in her previous unit. Some had received medals too, their actions on that terrible day deemed worthy of recognition. Others had simply gone back to their regular duties, grateful to have survived. And 2 had gone home in flag-draped coffins, leaving families and futures behind. Sarah had attended mandatory counseling sessions after the incident, as required by the military. She had sat in those sessions and answered the questions mechanically, saying what she needed to say to be cleared for continued duty. But she had never really processed what happened, never really dealt with the guilt that ate at her in quiet moments. She had just buried it, along with the metal that represented it, and tried to move forward. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it finally did, Sarah's dreams were filled with the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke. The next several days passed without incident. Sarah fell back into her routine, and the encounter with Admiral Richardson faded into just another moment in the ship's busy schedule. The carrier moved through its operational area, launching and recovering aircraft, conducting training exercises, and maintaining its readiness for whatever missions might come. Sarah's team worked long hours during a particularly intense period of flight operations. They loaded and reloaded weapons, managed inventory, and ensured that every piece of ordnance was accounted for and ready when needed. It was exhausting work, but Sarah preferred being exhausted. It meant she slept better, dreamed less. About a week after the Admiral's inspection, Sarah was called to report to the office of Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the officer in charge of her division. It wasn't an unusual request. Periodic meetings with division officers were part of normal operations, but Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety as she made her way to the administrative spaces. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was a competent officer who ran his division efficiently. He had always been fair with Sarah, giving her good performance evaluations and trusting her with increased responsibilities. Sarah respected him and had no reason to feel nervous about the meeting. But the encounter with the Admiral had left her on edge. She knocked on the doorframe and entered when Hayes called for her to come in. He was seated at his desk, which was covered with the paperwork and reports that seemed to multiply endlessly on a ship. He looked up and gestured for her to take a seat. "Petty Officer Martinez, thanks for coming. How have things been going with your team?" They spent a few minutes discussing operational matters, personnel issues, and upcoming training requirements. It was all standard stuff, and Sarah began to relax. This was just a normal check-in, nothing to worry about. But then Hayes leaned back in his chair and studied her with an expression that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of the way Admiral Richardson had looked at her. "I received an interesting inquiry the other day," he said carefully, "from the Admiral's staff. They were requesting additional information about your service record." Sarah's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "May I ask what kind of information, sir?" "Details about your previous assignments, commendations and awards, that sort of thing." Hayes folded his hands on his desk. "I have to admit, when I pulled your full record to respond, I was surprised by what I found. Your official commendations list includes a silver star." There it was. The secret she had tried so hard to keep had been uncovered. Not through any dramatic revelation, but through simple administrative channels. Sarah had known this moment might come eventually, but knowing it and experiencing it were two very different things. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Hayes studied her for a long moment. "That's a significant decoration, Martinez. One of the highest awards for valor. And yet you've never mentioned it, never worn it, and from what I can tell, you've actively avoided drawing any attention to it. Can I ask why?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "The circumstances that led to that award were difficult, sir. I lost good people that day. People I was responsible for. The medal doesn't feel like something worth celebrating." Hayes nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I read the citation. What you did saved 7 lives. That's not nothing." "It cost 2 lives," Sarah replied, her voice harder than she intended. "That's not nothing either." "No," Hayes agreed. "It's not. But you made decisions under impossible circumstances, and more people came home because of those decisions. That matters, Martinez." Sarah didn't respond. She had heard similar words from the officers who presented her with the medal, from the chaplain who spoke at the memorial service, from the counselors who cleared her for duty. None of them had been there in that moment when the world exploded into chaos and she had to choose who lived and who died. None of them had to carry those choices. Hayes seemed to sense that pushing further wouldn't be productive. He shifted in his chair and moved to a different topic. The Admiral specifically requested that you be commended in the next award cycle for your work on the carrier. He was impressed with your professionalism during the inspection and your quick thinking when your teammate stumbled. That's not necessary, sir, Sarah said quickly. I was just doing my job. Maybe, Hayes replied, but good work should be recognized. However, given what we've discussed, I'll note in my response that you prefer to maintain a low profile. The Admiral will respect that, I'm sure. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude toward her division officer. He was giving her a way to decline the recognition without having to explain herself to a 3-star admiral. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Hayes stood, indicating the meeting was over. Sarah rose as well and moved toward the door. But before she could leave, Hayes spoke again. Martinez, I want you to know that I respect what you went through and your desire to move past it. But you shouldn't feel like you have to hide what you accomplished. You earned that silver star. Not everyone could have done what you did. Sarah nodded, but didn't trust herself to speak. She left the office and made her way back to the ammunition deck, her mind swirling with thoughts and emotions she had worked hard to suppress. That evening, Sarah found herself back in the ship's library. She sat in her usual chair but didn't pick up a book. Instead, she stared at nothing, replaying the conversation with Hayes and thinking about what came next. The Admiral knew about her silver star now, which meant other people would probably find out too. The anonymity she had cherished was slipping away. Rodriguez found her there about an hour later. He took a seat across from her, and for a while, they just sat in silence. Finally, he spoke. Jenkins told me he heard something about you getting recommended for a commendation. Something about you being some kind of hero. Sarah closed her eyes. So it was already spreading through the rumor mill. That was fast, even by Navy standards. It's not like that. What is it like? Rodriguez asked gently. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at her friend. She saw genuine concern there, not curiosity or judgment. Rodriguez had always been decent, always been respectful of boundaries. She made a decision in that moment to trust him with at least part of the truth. I received a silver star a few years ago, she said quietly, for combat actions that went bad, really bad. I did what I had to do to get people out, but not everyone made it. That medal represents the worst day of my life, and I don't like talking about it. Rodriguez absorbed this information silently. Then he nodded. That makes sense. Thank you for telling me. He paused, then added, for what it's worth, I think you're one of the best sailors I've served with. Whatever happened before, you're solid now. You care about the work and you care about the people around you. That counts for something. Sarah felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. She had been so focused on avoiding recognition and hiding her past that she hadn't fully appreciated what she had built in the present. She had become good at her job, had earned the respect of her peers, and had found a kind of purpose in the careful, methodical work of handling ammunition. Maybe that was its own form of redemption. The weeks that followed brought an unexpected shift in Sarah's life aboard the Roosevelt. Word of her silver star had spread through the ship with the speed that gossip always travels in close quarters. Most sailors simply looked at her with new respect, nodding in acknowledgement when they passed her in the corridors. A few tried to ask questions, but Sarah's polite deflections usually discouraged further inquiry. She remained professional, focused, and kept her personal walls firmly in place. What surprised her most was that Rodriguez and the rest of her immediate team treated her exactly the same as they always had. There was no awkwardness, no sudden change in how they interacted with her. They still joked during breaks, still worked together with the same easy coordination, and still trusted her judgment on technical matters. It was a small gift of normalcy that Sarah hadn't realized she needed. About 3 weeks after her conversation with Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Sarah received an unexpected message. She was requested to report to the Admiral's conference room at 1400 hours. No explanation was provided, just the time and location. Sarah spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on her work while her anxiety built steadily. Whatever the Admiral wanted, it was significant enough to warrant a private meeting, rather than a simple message through the chain of command. She changed into a fresh uniform, made sure every detail was perfect, and arrived at the conference room 10 minutes early. The Admiral's aide, a crisp young lieutenant, greeted her and asked her to wait. Sarah stood at parade rest in the corridor, her mind running through possible scenarios. Maybe the Admiral wanted to ask her about her previous deployment. Maybe there was some administrative issue with her transfer. Maybe he simply wanted to meet the sailor whose record had caught his attention. At exactly 1400 hours, the door opened, and the aide gestured for Sarah to enter. The conference room was smaller than she expected, with a polished wooden table and chairs arranged formally. Admiral Richardson stood near the window, looking out at the ocean. He turned as Sarah entered, and she snapped to attention and saluted. "Petty Officer Martinez, please have a seat," the Admiral said, returning the salute and gesturing to one of the chairs. Sarah sat, her posture rigid and formal. The Admiral took a seat across from her, and for a moment, he simply studied her face. It was the same intense scrutiny from the ammunition deck, but this time, there was recognition in his eyes. "I knew I had seen you before," the Admiral said finally. "It took me a while to place it, but I eventually remembered. I was present at the ceremony where you received your Silver Star. I wasn't the presenting officer, but I was there representing the strike group. You looked very different that day." Sarah wasn't sure what to say, so she remained silent and waited for the Admiral to continue. "I also took the time to read the full classified report of the incident that led to your medal," Admiral Richardson continued. "Not just the citation, but the detailed after-action reports, the witness statements, the intelligence assessments. What you accomplished that day was remarkable, Petty Officer. The tactical situation was catastrophic. You were operating with limited resources and no backup, and yet you managed to extract 7 personnel and critical intelligence while under sustained enemy fire. 2 people died, sir," Sarah said quietly. It was the only thing she could think to say, the only thing that mattered to her. "Yes," the Admiral acknowledged. "Corporal Davis and Sergeant Thompson. I read about them too. Both were exceptional soldiers who understood the risks of the mission they volunteered for. Their deaths were tragic, but they were not your failure." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had heard versions of this speech before, and it never helped. The logic was sound, but logic couldn't erase the weight of those losses. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Admiral Richardson nodded. "Granted. With respect, sir, I was the senior person on that mission. I made the call to proceed when we received intelligence about the ambush risk. I positioned people where I thought they would be most effective. When everything went wrong, I made the decisions about who would cover which positions during the extraction. Corporal Davis was covering our right flank because I put him there. Sergeant Thompson was holding the rear because I needed someone experienced in that position. They died in those positions. That's not something I can separate from my responsibility as a leader." The Admiral listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Tell me something, Martinez. If you had made different decisions that day, if you had positioned people differently or changed the extraction plan, do you believe more people would have survived?" Sarah had asked herself that question 1,000 times in the 3 years since the incident. "I don't know, sir. Maybe. Or maybe everyone would have died. There's no way to know." "Exactly," the Admiral said. "There's no way to know. You made the best decisions you could with the information available and the resources at hand. The enemy made decisions too, and sometimes the enemy gets lucky. Sometimes good people die despite everyone doing everything right. That's the reality of combat, and it's why leadership in those situations is so difficult." Sarah felt something crack inside her, some carefully maintained wall she had built to keep everything contained. "Those families, sir. Corporal Davis's fiancé, Sergeant Thompson's children. They looked at me at those funerals, and all I could think was that I was the reason their loved one wasn't coming home. And the 7 people who did come home because of you," the Admiral countered gently. "What about their families? The children who still have their parents, the spouses who still have their partners, the parents who didn't have to bury their children. Your decisions gave them that gift. You can't focus only on what was lost and ignore what was saved." Sarah blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that she had not allowed herself to shed in 3 years. The Admiral's words were cutting through her defenses in a way that all the previous counseling and well-meaning advice had not. Maybe it was because he was a senior officer who had seen real combat, who understood the weight of command decisions. Maybe it was because she was finally ready to hear it. Or maybe it was simply that she was exhausted from carrying the guilt alone for so long. "Why am I here, sir?" Sarah asked, her voice rough. "Why did you want to see me?" Admiral Richardson stood and walked to a cabinet along the wall. He opened it and retrieved a small wooden box, which he placed on the table between them. "I asked you here for 2 reasons. First, I wanted to understand why an exceptionally decorated sailor was hiding in the ammunition deck of my carrier, avoiding any recognition or advancement. Now I understand. Second, I wanted to give you something." He opened the box, revealing a gleaming silver star medal. But this one was different from Sarah's. The ribbon was fresh and bright, the metal polished to a mirror finish. It was mounted on a display backing, clearly meant to be presented formally. "This is a replacement for your medal," the Admiral explained. "The one you received 3 years ago has likely suffered from being hidden away and not properly cared for. This is a new one, properly presented, because I think it's important that you understand something. This medal is not a monument to your worst day. It's a recognition of your best qualities as a leader and a sailor. Your courage, your quick thinking, your dedication to the people under your command. Those qualities didn't die when Corporal Davis and Sergeant Thompson died. They're still part of who you are." Sarah stared at the medal, her emotions in turmoil. Part of her wanted to refuse it, to maintain her stance that she didn't deserve recognition. But another part of her, a part she had suppressed for a long time, recognized the truth in the Admiral's words. She had been courageous that day. She had thought quickly under impossible circumstances. She had cared deeply about getting her people home. "I can't forget them, sir," Sarah said quietly. "I won't forget them." "I'm not asking you to forget them," Admiral Richardson replied. "I'm asking you to honor their memory by being the leader I can see you're capable of becoming. The kind of leader who cares about their people, who takes responsibility seriously, who makes hard decisions when necessary. The Navy needs leaders like that, and hiding in the ammunition deck isn't honoring anyone's memory. It's just hiding from your own potential." The Admiral closed the box and slid it across the table towards Sarah. "This is yours to do with as you see fit. You can display it, store it, wear it, or hide it again. That's your choice. But I want you to think about something. You transferred to ordnance work because you thought it would be safer, less likely to put you in situations where your decisions affect lives. But that's not true, is it? Every day you work with weapons and ammunition that will be used in combat. Every safety check you perform, every procedure you follow perfectly. Every time you train a new sailor on proper handling techniques, you're affecting lives. You're making sure pilots come home, making sure weapons function as designed, making sure missions succeed. That's leadership too, just a different kind." Sarah picked up the box, feeling its weight in her hands. The Admiral was right. She had thought she was escaping leadership and responsibility, but she had just found a different way to serve. The work she did on the ammunition deck mattered. The precision and care she brought to every task mattered. The example she set for her teammates mattered. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll think about what you've said." Admiral Richardson nodded. "That's all I ask." Dismissed. Sarah stood, saluted, and left the conference room with the box under her arm. She walked slowly back to her berthing area, her mind processing everything that had happened. The Admiral had given her more than a replacement medal. He had given her permission to move forward, to accept that she could be both someone who had lost people under her command and someone who was still capable of leading effectively. When she reached her berthing area, her roommates were out, giving her privacy. Sarah sat on her rack and opened the box, looking at the pristine silver star inside. It was beautiful, formal, properly presented. It looked like something that should be displayed with pride, not hidden in shame. She pulled out the worn medal that hung around her neck on its simple chain. The 2 medals side by side told a story. One represented the raw pain of loss, worn close to her heart as a reminder and a penance. The other represented recognition and honor, a formal acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. Both were true. Both were part of her story. Sarah made a decision. She would keep the worn medal as it was, a personal reminder of what had been lost and why she did what she did. But she would take the new medal and do something different with it. She would have it properly mounted and keep it somewhere she could see it, not to glorify herself but to remember that she was capable of more than hiding from her past. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how she approached her work. She still maintained her careful, methodical attention to detail, but she stopped avoiding opportunities to mentor junior sailors. When new personnel rotated into the ammunition division, she took time to train them properly, sharing not just the procedures but the reasons behind them. She started speaking up more in team meetings, offering suggestions and insights based on her experience. Rodriguez noticed the change. "You seem different lately," he commented one afternoon as they were securing a load of ordnance. "More relaxed or something?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Just figuring some things out." "That Admiral talked to you?" "Yeah." "It help?" Sarah considered the question. "Yeah, actually, it did." Rodriguez nodded, satisfied. He didn't ask for details, which Sarah appreciated. Some conversations were private, and he respected that. About a month after her meeting with Admiral Richardson, Sarah received notification that she was being recommended for promotion to first-class petty officer. The recommendation came from Lieutenant Commander Hayes and was endorsed by the Admiral himself. Sarah's first instinct was to deflect, to find a way to avoid the added responsibility and visibility that came with promotion. But she thought about what the Admiral had said about honoring people's memory through leadership rather than hiding. She accepted the recommendation. When the promotion ceremony came several weeks later, Sarah stood in her dress uniform among a dozen other sailors being advanced. Her family couldn't be present since the carrier was deployed, but Rodriguez, Miller, and Jenkins were there, along with Lieutenant Commander Hayes and several other officers from her division. As she stood at attention and received her new rank insignia, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride, yes, but also continued sadness for what had been lost. Determination to honor those losses through excellent service. Hope that maybe she could find a way to be both a good sailor and someone who had failed to save everyone she was responsible for. The two things didn't have to be mutually exclusive. After the ceremony, as she was accepting congratulations from her teammates, she felt the weight of the worn silver star beneath her uniform. She had continued wearing it, that personal reminder against her skin. But now it felt different. Less like a weight and more like a talisman, a connection to a moment that had shaped her but didn't have to define her entire future. That evening, Sarah wrote 2 letters. The first was to Corporal Davis's fiancé, whom Sarah had not contacted since the funeral. She explained that she thought about him often, that his sacrifice had not been forgotten, that she was trying to honor his memory by being the kind of leader he would have been proud to serve with. The second letter was to Sergeant Thompson's oldest child, who would be a teenager now. She shared memories of the sergeant's dedication, his humor, his love for his family, and his commitment to his mission. Writing the letters was difficult, bringing back memories she had worked hard to suppress. But it also felt necessary, a step toward accepting her past, rather than running from it. Sarah didn't know if the recipients would welcome the letters or if they would reopen painful wounds. But she felt she owed them the acknowledgement that their loved ones mattered, that their losses had affected her deeply, and that she carried the weight of those losses with the seriousness they deserved. As the months passed, Sarah settled into her new rank and the responsibilities that came with it. She became known throughout the ship as someone who was exceptionally good at her job and who took the development of junior sailors seriously. She didn't talk about her silver star, but she no longer actively hid it either. When people found out about it, she acknowledged it simply and moved the conversation forward. Rodriguez eventually transferred to a new duty station, but before he left, he pulled Sarah aside for a final conversation. "You know," he said, "when I first met you, I thought you were just really private. Kept to yourself, didn't share much. I respected that, but I worried you were too isolated, you know?" "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now, I think you were just figuring out how to carry something really heavy. And I think you've figured it out. You're still you, still private, but you're not hiding anymore." "That's good. That's really good." Sarah smiled. "Thanks, Rodriguez. You're a good friend. Stay in touch, Martinez. And don't be a stranger if we ever end up on the same ship again." After Rodriguez left, Sarah found herself reflecting on his words. He was right. She was still private, still careful about what she shared and with whom. But she was no longer hiding, no longer running from her past or the recognition that came with it. She had found a way to integrate all the parts of herself, the decorated veteran and the careful technician, the leader who had lost people and the mentor who helped others succeed. One afternoon, nearly a year after Admiral Richardson's inspection, Sarah was working in the ammunition storage area when a young airman approached her nervously. The airman was new to the ship, fresh from training, and clearly intimidated by Sarah's reputation. "Petty Officer Martinez," the airman said hesitantly, "I heard you have a silver star. Is that true?" Sarah paused in her work and looked at the young sailor. She could see the nervousness there, but also genuine curiosity and perhaps a desire for guidance. A year ago, she would have deflected the question and moved on. Now, she made a different choice. "Yes, it's true," Sarah said simply. "That's really impressive," the airman said. "What was it like, earning something like that?" Sarah set down her clipboard and gave the question the consideration it deserved. "It was the worst and most important day of my life," she said honestly. "I lost people I cared about, and I had to make decisions I still think about every day. The medal recognizes what I did right, but it doesn't erase what went wrong. It's complicated." The airman absorbed this, looking thoughtful. "But you kept serving. You're still here." "I am," Sarah agreed, "because the work matters and the people matter, and running away from hard things doesn't make them easier. You learn to carry what you need to carry and keep moving forward." The airman nodded slowly. "I hope I can be that strong if I ever face something difficult." Sarah smiled slightly. "You will be. And when that time comes, remember that being strong doesn't mean not feeling the weight of things. It means feeling it and choosing to carry it anyway because the mission and the people are worth it." The conversation ended, and Sarah returned to her work, but she felt something shift inside her, a final piece of acceptance falling into place. She would never stop thinking about Corporal Davis and Sergeant Thompson. She would never believe she had done everything perfectly that terrible day. But she could accept that she had done her best under impossible circumstances, and she could honor their memory by continuing to serve with the same dedication they had shown. That evening, Sarah took the formal silver star that Admiral Richardson had given her and placed it on a shelf in her small locker space where she could see it. Next to it, she placed a photograph she had kept hidden for years, showing her entire unit from that deployment, all 9 of them smiling and dusty and exhausted but together. It hurt to look at it, knowing that 2 of those faces belonged to people who would never age beyond that moment. But it also reminded her of what she had been part of, the bond between people who served together and looked out for each other. The worn silver star remained on its chain around her neck, close to her heart, but now it felt different, less like a burden and more like a bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. Sarah Martinez would never be someone who wore her medals proudly in public or told stories of her heroism. That wasn't who she was. But she had learned to carry her past without letting it crush her, to acknowledge both her achievements and her losses, and to keep moving forward with purpose and dedication. In the end, perhaps that was its own form of courage. Not the dramatic kind that earned medals, but the quiet, persistent kind that showed up every day and did the work that needed doing, carrying the weight of experience and memory while still believing that service mattered, that people mattered, and that she could make a difference even with all her scars and regrets. The carrier continued its mission, cutting through the ocean waters with its complement of thousands. And somewhere in the ammunition deck, a first-class petty officer named Sarah Martinez stocked weapons and trained sailors and carried a silver star both around her neck and in her locker, all 3 versions of the same truth. She had earned it. She had survived it. And now, finally, she was learning to live with it.